Welcome back to the Engineered Angler. This week we're going to do part 2 of the Swimbait Master Class. So enough said, let's get started. So in part 1 we went through defining a swimbait as a lure that depends completely on its shape to get the action, whether it's a multi-part or a single part lure. How top to bottom symmetry can simplify your design, and how to overcome a really asymmetric design to get a lure that swims well slow or fast. The importance of turbulence in your design, and how to find the perfect spot for that tie-on-eye so that you end up with a stable swimming action. We talked about the effects of drag on a lure with lots of segments and how that can affect the swim and push the action back. I explained weight and balance and showed you my technique for finding the right weight for the lure. In part 2, I want to talk a lot more about the different types of hinges, what effects they have on the swim, and on your ability to make the lure with a lot more segments. But before we get to that, I want to talk a little more about one-part swim baits. Now these aren't my favorite, but I know a lot of people like to troll a one-part swim bait out on lakes and even in the ocean. And just like multi-part swim baits, the real enemy of these things is roll. And I'm talking about body roll. So while the lure may be swimming, it also will want to roll quite a bit. Now the more roll you get, the more likely the lure won't be able to be trolled very fast. And in fact, it may not be able to be trolled very well at all. And you might not even be able to actually retrieve it really well with a reel. And on a one-piece swim bait, the key to avoiding that is having the weight and balance on this just right. And to get a good start on your weight and balance, you have to be working with a material to make the lure out of that has a density somewhere around 7 grams per cubic centimeter or less. That's not to say you can't get away with a heavier material, but it becomes more and more difficult to get this thing balanced so it doesn't roll on you when you have a heavier material. So even heavy hardwoods like live oak will give you some difficulty, because the key is that you want to have your center of buoyancy and your center of gravity in a tug of war with each other. And if your buoyancy is too low, there isn't much of a tug of war. The weight of the lure will way outweigh, literally, any buoyancy in the material you're using. And that'll allow the lure to roll. Now to help with this scenario, and I mentioned this in the last video, you want the cross section of your lure to look somewhat like that, where the top of the lure is wider and thicker than the bottom of the lure. This way you have a lot more buoyant material up here, and you have just enough room down here to place your lead weight to counteract the buoyancy. Case in point here, this lure I made in the last video, and it's made out of solid resin. It's a clear resin, and it sinks relatively fast. So since this lure is made out of material that is really pretty dense and will sink on its own without any weight, so there's very little differential between the buoyancy and the total weight of the lure will tend to roll when it's being retrieved. And what that means for this lure is that it's essentially a twitch bait, which is really what I wanted anyway. But the lure that it's patterned on is made with a casting resin that has a density about 6.5 grams per cubic centimeter. So these two lures are the exact same lures. They're cast out of the exact same mold, but they're made from different materials. And that accounts for the big difference in the ability for the one made with a lighter material to swim nicely, and this one not to swim at all. You can see it roll to the left, roll to the right, and never really find a rhythm. And if you try reeling it in really fast, it'll just blow out, you can see. And here you see the one made with lightweight resin. Swims very nicely on a steady retrieve. And on one-part swim baits, the location of that tie-on-eye is even more important than it is for multi-part swim baits. Of course, I'm saying all this and I'm assuming that you shaped your lure perfectly symmetric from left to right side. And that's looking straight into it. Because if you've got that off, it'll definitely blow out on you, whether it's one part or multi-part. And when you weigh this one part, you want the weight as low as you can get it, and you want it to be either perfectly horizontal or just slightly tail heavy. Usually nose heavy means a little less action. So I usually go for a slightly tail heavy one-piece swim bait. So let's imagine we're gonna go ahead and have joints on this shape. This is a bit of a challenging shape, but it can be done. And in this case, we'll divide it in 3 equal sections. And that's a perfectly legitimate way to do it. You can manipulate the action a little bit by changing those dimensions, but this is a good way to get started. Now these joints that we're imagining here aren't inset, so they're basically just flat to each other, which isn't the most elegant way to do it, but it will work if that's all you're going to do. And we'll get into insetting these joints in a minute. First, let's talk about the way we make the actual hinges. The most typical hinge will be two linked eyes like these screw-in eyes, or if you prefer, you can make your own out of wire and just twist them yourself. Either way, what you'll do is you'll drill holes and you'll embed these and glue them in. And that's the most common kind of hinge you're going to see out there. You'll even see them quite a bit on commercial lures. And I call this kind of hinge a banner hinge. And the reason I call it that is because it swings like a banner in the wind, and the action of the tail doesn't really propagate up into the head. So you just have whatever action is being generated by the turbulence across the body while you're reeling it in. And there's several types of banner hinges. They can be flat cut or inset with a V-cut. And even a lure like this that has a continuous fabric hinge, I still consider a banner hinge. Actually, this is probably more of a banner hinge than any of the other ones. They work well, there's no doubt about it. But as you move into longer and longer lures, more and more segments, the banner hinge becomes less and less effective because most of the movement gets pushed back farther and farther away from the head and more towards the tail. And none of that movement gets propagated back to the head. The other extreme of hinges is a double hinge, and this hinge allows for both halves to fold completely and to move adjacent to each other. It creates a really weird action in the water. Of course, this is on a crankbait, but when it's used on a swim bait, the action you end up with is a really weird combination of banner movement where it's just swinging behind it, and then every now and then it'll want to sort of move past it and along its side. It's a really odd movement. Don't really recommend it, but it's actually kind of interesting to experiment with. And then the final hinge, and this is the hinge that I prefer, is a power hinge. And of course, these are all names that I've given them since I've been experimenting with them. And this is a hinge where you have a hinge plate or a hinge wire that extends back deep enough into the body of the next section that as it rotates, it actually comes out of alignment with the front. So you end up with a lot of turbulence generated. And this is kind of similar to a balanced rudder on a boat, on a sailboat. So a regular rudder might have a rudder post like this and the rudder blade sticking out behind it. So when it turns out of the flow, all the force is pushing it back into the flow. But if you move that rudder stock back just a few inches, as you turn the rudder, that little piece in front of the rudder post moves against the flow coming at it and wants to keep the rudder turning in that direction. But since the back part of the rudder is so much bigger, the water hits that and wants to straighten it out. And they do that to sort of semi-balance the rudder so there's not a lot of load on it. But the key here is that you end up with that section of that front section moving out past the flow and creating a lot of turbulence going back. And I know this is a lot of detail, but I hope that there's some people out there that appreciate a little extra information. So what ends up happening is even that very last tail section creates a lot of turbulence, gets pushed back really hard, and that action gets translated all the way up the body and creates a really big undulating movement. Now, a lot of you are saying, well, I don't really want a giant movement on my lure, and that's fine. But you can take that same general design and depower a little bit by moving that pin a little closer to the end of that lure section, and it doesn't go out as far, but it continues to power the lure. That's why I call it a power hinge. And why that's beneficial is that it creates a lure that will swim at very slow speed, so you don't have to rip it in. So you can just ease it in and it'll snake around really nicely with very little speed coming back. And there's a lot of lures out there that you can buy off the rack that will swim well at a pretty good consistent speed. But if you slow them down a little bit, they just pull straight. But if you use a power hinge, you won't have that problem. So another key feature that a lot of lure makers will kind of gloss over is where your widest point is. Now, this is looking down on the lure, sort of like that. And if it's a one-piece swim bait, you really want to be able to generate turbulence early in the lure. So you want the head to be relatively pointed. You don't want a big round nose. And you want the widest spot between 1/4 and 1/3 of the way back. And a sharper entry at the nose is better than a duller entry. And for one-piece swim baits, it should either narrow quickly right past the center point or narrow looking down on it just past the center point or both. And that will create turbulence back here and allow that tail to loosen up. So I know a lot of lure makers really like using V-cut joints, and they're perfectly fine. The only thing that I don't like about them, well, a couple of things I don't like about them. One, is they're a little difficult to make. Two, is that they really hinder the degree to which these things will offset. And if you only have a 2-part lure, that can mean very little movement. As you get to 3 and 4 part, it starts to matter less. Of course, you can get more deflection by moving these segments apart, but then you start losing one of the benefits, and that is the fact that it hides the hardware really well. You can go with a flat butt joint kind of arrangement, but that actually hinders the movement even more. It certainly is the easiest way to make it, but I think it's the least beneficial. Or you can go with the rounded back, which is essentially a knuckle without a socket. This gives you the added motion, but still has the hardware pretty much out in the open. This is a really good way to do it if you want a simple carve and a really simple mold. This little mullet lure that I made a long time ago, and I've made a lot of these, has a great action, has a lot of body movement. You can see it does have a power hinge in it. You can see how it moves outside the line of the flow, but it doesn't have a socket joint. So it does reveal the hardware pretty much. But I can tell you this, the big trout don't care. I've had this thing so deep inside of trout's throat, I almost couldn't get it out. But this is really my favorite style of joint. I call it a knuckle joint. It actually is a knuckle with a socket. That's what I used on this big mackerel bait, and it's also what I used on this long eel bait. Again, you end up with a lot of movement, and you still end up with the hardware pretty nicely hidden. So the hardware isn't very noticeable on either one of these. Now you'll notice that the hinge on this is made from a plate of aluminum, a very small piece. And I don't do that very much anymore because I only did that when I wanted that pin to be way back here so that when it turned, it would be way out in the flow of the water. But I really don't do that much anymore. I find that just a small amount of distance from here is all it takes. And since I don't have to extend a hinge loop all the way out here, I can use just a twist eye as my hinge. And I hope you can see that in there. That's what I used on this one and most of the swim baits that I've made in the last couple of years. Now we talked about the wide point as far as girth and the location for that. And I like on both multi-part swim baits and single part swim baits to align that wide point with the tallest point of the lure up and down. That seems to work really well just about every time I use it. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about fins and tail. This lure has both. It's got some small little fins and a tail on its own hinge. This lure has long, full body, kind of eel-like fins, and this lure has some little ridged fins here, not much of anything, and a fiber tail. Personally, I'm not a big fan of putting fins on. I think they look great, and if you can put a tail on that will move independently, I think that's good too. But if you're just using a banner hinge and you put a tail fin on it, you're gonna find a really drastic change in the amount of movement you're gonna get out of that lure. And that was one of the reasons why I came up with the power hinge, is to overcome that. So if you're gonna have tails and fins, first of all, don't have fins coming out laterally. Don't have pectoral fins. I'm not saying it's impossible to get a lure to work, but I'm saying that it gets a lot more difficult to get a lure that will pull straight and not roll out on you if you put those kind of fancy fins on there. Try to keep your fins small and in line with the center line. That'll give you the best chance to having a lure that actually will work well. All right, well, I get tons of questions about this stuff and I try to answer them as clearly as I can online, but I can't always get to all the details. Hopefully this session on the dry erase board did the trick for you guys, and maybe you figured out some of the issues that you've been having with yours. So on the community section of the channel, I posted a few weeks ago a P.O. box that I got for the channel, so that if you want to send me something that you'd like me to take a look at, review, or try out, you can send it to that address. Remember, it's a P.O. box, so I don't think UPS will ship to it. And my idea behind that is that maybe I can help people troubleshoot issues they're having with lures that they have. And maybe that can become part of the programming. Maybe once a month we can do a troubleshooting session to see if we can't make a lure work better than it does. All right, well, thanks for watching. If you like this kind of stuff, let me know. If you don't, let me know too. If you want me to stick to just making lures, let me know that too. But otherwise, give me a thumbs up no matter what, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next Friday.